Graduates Conversations podcast.
All right, I'm just going to reposition my seating for the next few questions now. Michael, let's have a look at this one. This one comes from a Thai interpreter or an interpreting candidate from Victoria. I've recently completed a NAATI endorsed qualification, Advanced Diploma Interpreting, with the goal to become a professional who's ready to work in the TNI industry, as well as to become eligible to sit for the NAATI Accreditation Certified Interpreter test. However, with a very limited test schedule and availability, I have to wait until October 2023 to sit for the test. That is a very long wait. And unfortunately, I was also rejected by NAATI certification team to apply for recognized interpreter. I believe NAATI has done everything it can to make sure we've got a good system to produce professionals in the TNI industry. But this is something you need to review. Practicing interpreters who have completed NAATI endorsed qualification should be recognized by NAATI while waiting for the certification test. Could you please take this with a careful consideration to work collaboratively with the institutes who offer NAATI endorsement courses so you can ensure the tests are offered at a reasonable time? So I guess, in conjunction with when they finish their courses. Second question, could you please help explain or guide us who has no luck on the test booking to be eligible for RPI? Are you suggesting we commence work as a non-accredited interpreter, get some work experience for at least 3 months before we can apply for it? If NAATI cannot increase the capacity or offer the test more frequently, would you consider making us, who have completed the endorsed qualification, eligible to apply for recognized practicing interpreter whilst we are waiting to sit the test? This will allow us to commence work and be recognized in the industry as a professional interpreter. Please kindly consider our request. We really appreciate your attention and support during this journey. Michael, sorry for that extremely long question, but I thought that I had to read all that out. It made very good sense. What do you say to this? First of all, can you work with your institutions, your NAATI endorsed institutions, to see if you can align the tests to when they are graduating their students? So whether it be, I guess, with the mid-semester or mid-year graduation or the end-of-year graduation. Because yes, people might be finishing their course in June and then their test is available next February, March, in this case, October 2023. And the second question is, until they are able to sit the test, would you consider giving them recognized practicing interpreter so they can at least start gaining some experience out there?
Awesome. So the first point I would make is recognised practicing with NAATI we offer to languages that we don't test in or where a test is not available for a year. So our standard rule is if it was, in this case, Thai, that within 12 months, if there wasn't a test, we would absolutely offer recognised practicing. We are thinking about how we can use recognised practicing more flexibly to give potential candidates the opportunity to get some work experience, but that's an ongoing discussion that we need to have with stakeholders and institutions. So the current standing is if a test is not available for a year, absolutely we would offer recognised practicing. Where that doesn't translate into this question from Thai is because the Thai CI test is not yet available and it won't be until October 2023 because it's just not been developed yet. But we have the alternative for Thai, which is the Certified Provisional Test. And I definitely know that our Melbourne office has worked with several candidates to offer Thai CPI test in the interim, and then upon completion of that test, to then when the CI test is available, to only pay the difference in the test prices to be able to do the higher level qualification. So, very specifically for Thai, recognised practicing, there is CPI tests available, and our preference would be to do a proper credential that has been tested rather than recognised practicing, which is only based on educational attainment. And then to flesh that comment out a little bit more, there's over 200 languages spoken in Australia. We're committed to getting as many as we can tested, but it takes time, and like any business, I guess we have to look at what resources are available and what demand there is. So seems like a long time away, but we have to work through all the languages we've got, and which sort of ties in with the other question about tying it in with the semester end dates for education institutions. If we tied it in completely with the ends of semesters, we would have 50 languages tested in 2 weeks in July, and then nothing for 4 or 5 months. So we only have 48 odd test weeks a year that we can effectively use. We can usually get about 3 languages tested per week because there's a training day for role players and test invigilators the day before a test, and then the day of the test itself. And we're doing that nationally. So we try and spread test out as best as we can to meet the demand frequency, but also just to accommodate everyone at the same time. So it's not perfect, we appreciate, but we're working on some other technologies as well to allow more remote testing, more video interpreting. We're doing some because of COVID. We're trying to really improve that capability. So where we have capacity potentially in Western Australia, for example, we might be able to run a higher demand language more frequently via video to allow then the Melbourne test venue to look after other languages, and we can do more Arabic or Turkish or Spanish tests that are in higher demand. So we've done that a little bit in the last 6 to 12 months, definitely working with institutions to add test sessions that aren't already in the calendar. So we've got our test calendar out until 2023, hence why the Thai CI can see it. But we've added at least 4 test sessions in conjunction with university in the last 6 months to meet the very specific demands where we have been able to of large cohorts of candidates have come through. So if we can guarantee that we'll get 4 or 5 candidates, then it's absolutely worth us doing what we can to put a out of session test session in to accommodate that demand.
Very good, because we do need to recognise definitely that sometimes, at the very least, if you're finishing your course mid-year, you've got 6-7 months to then wait for potentially sitting your test in either February or March, let's say. So it can be quite a daunting experience for the candidates to go through that stressful time. And then maybe not having access to as much practice opportunities as they would have had during the time that they were students in their institutions. So it's good to know that you do know that this is happening, and with the help of remote testing, and to be able to use the resources across the nation. I really like that idea of Western Australia helping Victoria out and vice versa. I think there's a lot to be said about that. So well done, and we look forward to hopefully one day to be able to sit your test as soon as you finish your course, because I understand that until a few years ago, the institutions would test the students themselves. And then they would, NAATI would then give them the accreditation. But I guess since 2018, since the whole system changed, that responsibility, I guess, was taken away from institutions and was put solely on NAATI. And you have been working on building the numbers, building the test, building your team. And like you say, we're in 2021, 2018. It's a little baby, isn't it?
It is only, considering the 40+ year of NAATI history, it is a very recent development, and very specifically to that point of the tests all being done by NAATI. And we will continue to do what we can to improve accessibility to candidates. But that decision was a very key part of the NAATI testing paper that was released in 2012. which was if there is a central body responsible for the testing, it gets rid of any perceived or real discrepancy in individual institutions testing themselves. So that's why that it was brought in the NAATI itself, rather than allowing institutions to continue doing it, just to ensure that it was a one standard applied equally, regardless of where the training was conducted.
What if you were, this is now me asking you the question, what if you were to put supervisors, invigilators within institutions? Because then they would set the tests up, they would have, they might even wear the cost of having the role players, but they would set it up in ideal NAATI standards, and then you would only have to send maybe 2-3 supervisors, invigilators to supervise the test to make sure of their integrity.
Yes. I guess you'd never say never, but there is a lot of hurdles for it to jump over before we would consider that appropriate. Because in addition to test supervisors ensuring that the test was run appropriately, it's the availability of test materials that have been trained to an appropriate standard, and then the equipment being of a reliable specification and consistent quality. So there is a couple of other factors involved in that. Again, never say never, but it's certainly not something that we've considered at the moment.
Now, I have a few comments, actually, maybe not directly questions, some comments. And I know that both of the owners of these comments are interpreter candidates. Okay, so they are either studying or they've finished their studies, they're about to sit the test, or they have. Now, this is about some of their observations about what they have seen with practicing interpreters out there. And I guess they are now more verbal because after completing their studies, they now know what's expected from an interpreter. And, you know, they could have been interpreting for their family members for years, but now they've actually seen what an interpreter is supposed to do and not supposed to do during their studies in preparation for the NAATI test. They've made some of these comments, so let's see how we can address them. I'm not an interpreter yet. I have family members who are on workers' compensation and often require an interpreter. Problem is the interpreter does not know terminology for workers' compensation. Often my family members become frustrated when dealing with interpreters. I know this is not recommended, but there is really no other option, so I have to be an interpreter for them. The LOTE speaker becomes frustrated. This isn't a one-off thing either. It's everywhere when interpreters are used on the phone with insurance companies or WIRO, in person with rehab. It's everywhere when interpreter used on the phone or face-to-face. I have seen this happen over 99% of the time. Just the other day, a family member called WIRO with an interpreter. They became frustrated and the interpreter was difficult. I called back 2 days later and funny enough stumbled on the same person who the family member spoke to, and she told me that even though she did not speak the language, she could feel that the interpreting was going nowhere. The interpreter was yelling and refusing to interpret. This is not acceptable and needs to be fixed ASAP. Thanks. Now, just before I get your comments on that, I have another very similar comment from another interpreting candidate. After a person passes their NAATI test, they are not really required to sit any other test unless they want a higher accreditation. They must show PD in their language, but that is pretty much it. I have spent years observing interpreters for various family members. I have seen interpreters omit large chunks of information, not interpreting everything or interpreting in the third person. Just last week, I was in an appointment with an interpreter and shock, horror, the interpreter was interpreting in the third person. Guaranteed, if you tested these interpreters today, they would fail their exam. If I'm not present at these important appointments for family members, how do I know if the interpreter is doing their job properly? There seems to be a double standard for interpreters and those who want to be interpreters. It looks like it's okay if you haven't passed the NAATI exam. So, there's some issues there with potentially some interpreters that are out there, maybe not at the standard that NAATI is testing current candidates. There's a little bit of, I guess, an observation or a frustration that the candidates have to go through a very rigorous and a difficult test process, whereas you might have interpreters out there that have received their accreditation from years ago. And as we know, yes, they transitioned, but they had to do a Shushataj workshop, and that was pretty much it, I believe. What do you think about these, where you have these interpreter candidates that are being tested at a very high level? And it's great that they are being tested at that level, but then you also might have interpreters out there, maybe that aren't even at the level that the current candidates are being tested at. How do you deal with that?
There's probably there's a lot in these couple of statements, I guess. So the first one is the interpreters being used. We don't know whether they were NAATI certified, but we'll assume they are for the purpose of the question.
Both of these candidates are the Greek language. So let's assume that Greek being an established language, and hopefully these are certified interpreters and not unaccredited ones. Yep. Okay,
so assuming that they're NAATI certified, there's a couple of mechanisms in the first instance that I make the general comment that NAATI is not a direct employer of interpreters for the purposes of interpreting, and we don't offer services. So there is a relationship between the interpreter that's working and the employer, in this case potentially a hospital or a language service provider that's providing the service on behalf of the hospital. In the first instance, there is the ability for a consumer that is receiving those services to state their disappointment with the quality provided, no different than in any other interaction with a business that we have. And hopefully pull me up on it if I haven't been able to tie all the parts together. I'll try. So that's the first part. There is a direct relationship with the person providing the service and an employer, in this case either a hospital or language service provider, with the intention from us, I guess, as well as consumers, that if complaints were received about an employee or a language service provider not providing an adequate service, that they would, by virtue of their underperformance, not be used again and lose work, and then other people wouldn't employ them. That's sort of part one. Part two of that is NAATI has a complaints mechanism where if there is an interpreter or a translator that is certified by us that hasn't met the standards of the industry, there's a code of conduct which AUSIT and NAATI share, which has items in it like professional conduct, ensuring that they reflect the profession in a professional and honourable way, I guess, and behave accordingly. The yelling and refusing to interpret is clearly against the professional conduct part of the Code of Ethics. There is a requirement for practitioners to ensure competence, so only take competence which they're competent and able to deliver, which in the case of WIRO, which is, I believe, I could be wrong, the Workers' Compensation Independent Review Office.
That's right, in New South Wales. Yeah.
In New South Wales. So if in that scenario the interpreter didn't have the skills to do that job, they shouldn't have been doing it as part of the Code of Ethics. And accuracy and interpreting mode, they're all parts of the Code of Conduct. So the initial stage is, as a consumer, if you're receiving poor service, bring it up with the person providing the poor service, and whether that's the management of the employee in that scenario, of the practitioner in that scenario, or the health board, or there is a direct mechanism there. And in addition to that, then NAATI has the ability to question certified practitioners around issues such as this as well. We're not the first port of call because we don't have investigative powers. We can't go and force information from people or get testimonials and stuff. But in egregious cases where where a practitioner has done something that has caused, a criminal offence or the like, where we received a police report about a practitioner, for example, where they've done something against the code of conduct, quite, acted fraudulently or acted unethically to the point where it's caused damage, then that would be a case for revocation of certification.
Mm.
I would comment that, though, revoking someone's certification also denies them a livelihood. So we're looking at a reasonably high bar of misconduct. It'd have to be serious misconduct for us to consider the revocation of a certification. However,
that's very extreme, I guess. It could be like confidentiality is broken to the point that it might have affected someone else's health or life or freedom. It could be the fact that maybe competence. I mean, you don't know enough about this topic, so we're going to revoke your license. But you should do more PD on this, and you should be more competent on this, and don't take work that's beyond your competence. So I do definitely understand that the bar's got to be very, very high when it comes to revoking someone's license. And within regards to, I guess, putting in a complaint, it needs to be done if you have witnessed something like this. And I think that now that these interpreting candidates, they know what an interpreter is supposed to do and not supposed to do, they can really see the difference now between a good or a bad interpreter. Maybe, before they completed their courses, they probably still had a good idea, but, they weren't able to see black from white so clearly. So they should definitely take it up with the service provider and put in that complaint, because, if the service provider doesn't know, how are they supposed to then say to the language agency, let's say, there's been a complaint about this person, please make sure that this person is either put through education training or worst case scenario, we don't want to be working with this interpreter again. And then, you're saying that potentially they might lose work, other people don't use them, and so on, which isn't great. This is people's livelihood. Ideally, you want them to re-educate, retrain, and hopefully get to a level where they can give competent interpreting. But I guess the voices need to be heard. And like you said, you don't have investigative powers. You don't have the authority to, I guess, go in there and tell people off. We always say that interpreters have to have a moral awareness to constantly self-evaluate. But there are a lot of family members out there. There are a lot of service providers out there. There are even non-English speakers out there that speak English well, but they prefer to use interpreting services because it's high-risk situations. And they're always being evaluated. So potentially you could have a non-English speaker complain saying, well, I actually said this, but it was interpreted as this. The interpreter needs to understand that they are constantly being watched by the non-English speaker and the service provider, and they can't just willy-nilly go in and do a mediocre job. You've got to always be at a very high standard, because any one of these people, plus you've got family members who are interpreted candidates, they could always be under the watch of people who could, I guess, see what they're doing right or wrong.
I think the flow on, apart from the direct relationship with the employer and our direct complaints procedure, the secondary part for us is really the recertification process. And it might not seem like a direct solve to this issue, but the way that we see it working is in the old accreditation system pre-2018, there was practitioners that were given accreditation for life. Mm. And that really showed there's some obvious issues with that, where they could lose currency of language, or they could not keep up with current terminology or work practice requirements. So the introduction of the certification system and recertification is designed to help address that. And when we look at the direct relationship with the employer and practitioner, if they are doing a poor job and getting complaints against them, it should lend itself to them not being able to get enough work practice to recertify their credential and eventually drop out of the system, or they're not doing enough professional development and then drop out of the system as well. So although it's an indirect way of trying to not control, but improve the industry as a whole so that poor practitioners do drop out because they're not getting work or not doing PD, and allowing the experienced and keen and well-educated new practitioners to come up and get those assignments and continue on in the system. So I appreciate it's not a direct solve for an immediate problem in a hospital environment, and that's distressing to hear examples like that, because I think it paints the whole industry poorly. But there are those mechanisms in place. They're not immediate, they're not direct, but they are designed to, over time, weed out some of those poorer practitioners from the industry. And even though we commented before about serious misconduct being one of the reasons for a revocation potentially, if we were to receive a dozen complaints from language service providers or hospitals that employ practitioners over a 3-year recertification cycle, you would have to say, as an organisation for us, that a dozen complaints from multiple employers added together becomes enough to say that we don't want you around anymore. And I'm not, I can't say that on the record that's exactly what would happen, because every case is different. Every bit of information is different. There's frivolous complaints and vexatious complaints, but we take it seriously and we take people's livelihood seriously as well. So the burden of proof has to be high. But if the complaints are coming through, we would have to absolutely consider them.
Oh, very good to know.
All Graduates Conversations Podcast.